Right. So the autonomic nervous system. Now, the reason I wanted to hit on this early is because it's a big part of the theory exam coming up, and also you'll have a lab assignment next week where you have to understand the autonomic nervous system in order to answer the questions. So I wanted to go ahead and give you all an introduction to the autonomic nervous system, which is, remember, it's also referred to as the visceral motor division, right? So think back to the visceral motor division and what it does. The visceral motor division transmits a signal from CNS to what effectors? Good. Smooth muscles, cardiac muscles, and glands. So the involuntary muscles and glands. So since it's involuntary, that means the activities are occurring without our even recognizing it. So it's the portion of the nervous system that operates in comparative secrecy behind the scenes. It manages a multitude of unconscious processes responsible for the body's homeostasis. So when you think of homeostasis, that should make you think of something important that helps to maintain balance in one way or another, such as temperature. Body temperature has to be regulated, it has to be stable, it has to be within a very narrow range. But why? So hopefully you all have enough of an understanding of homeostasis to understand why it's important. So why do we have to maintain blood pressure? Why do we have to maintain blood sugar? Why can't they go out of range? What would be the problem if our blood sugar was not regulated? So the amount of sugar or glucose, which we'll talk about, in our blood is too high. So what? Huh? You could go into a coma. Very good. But so what I want you all to start thinking about when you talk about body disorders, which most of you all I think are going into healthcare, a lot of it is going to depend on these homeostatic mechanisms breaking down. So in order for us to survive, our cells have to be functioning, right? So our cells have to be functioning optimally if we're healthy. So everything goes back to, when we say homeostasis, is making sure that all of the internal conditions are such that our cells are able to function normally. We want to make our cells happy because that's what we are, right? We are cells. So when we start talking about all of these homeostatic mechanisms, keeping body temperature, blood pressure, heart rate, so all of these things have to be maintained, because if they're not, that's going to have some effect on some part of the body, our body cells in particular. And we'll see some specifics as we get into it. But when you think of homeostasis, think in those terms, that whoever built the human body had to put in a mechanism to make sure that when body temperature goes high, there's some way to what? Bring it back down. Otherwise, we wouldn't be here. None of us would be here if that mechanism was not put into the human body. If the mechanism is not put in there to regulate blood glucose, we would not be here, right? So scientists are able to come up with drugs to help out. Now that we know, well, blood sugar being too high can cause death. Well, scientists figure out a way to help people whose homeostatic mechanism is not working. Okay? So, Walter Cannon, the scientist who coined the expression homeostasis, and fight or flight. So we'll talk about autonomic nervous system's two divisions, sympathetic and parasympathetic. And this individual dedicated his career to studying the autonomic nervous system, which is fascinating. So all of this is happening without us even realizing it's happening. So homeostasis cannot be maintained without what? The autonomic nervous system. So if I had to say one of the nervous system chapters is most important, it's going to be this one, especially since you all are going into healthcare. So having an understanding of how the systems are supposed to work, how homeostasis allows the systems to continue to perform optimally, and what happens when those homeostasis mechanisms go awry. That's kind of something you all need to be able to do without too much thinking at some point. You all will get there. All right, so the ANS, autonomic nervous system, is a motor nervous system, visceral motor to be precise, that controls our glands. And what are glands again? What is a gland? What do glands do? So they're structures, organs, or tissues that secrete. Okay? And they secrete just for no reason, or they have to be told when to secrete. They have to be told when to secrete, just like our muscles have to be told when to what? Contract. And who does the telling? Who tells the muscles to contract? Exactly. So the nervous system, the CNS, sends signals through nerves to the muscles and glands. So the autonomic nervous system controls our glands, our cardiac muscles, and smooth muscles. What about the skeletal muscles? So those are controlled by the somatic motor division, not the visceral or ANS. The primary organs of the autonomic nervous system are the viscera, there's that word again, viscera of the ventral body cavity, the thoracic and abdominal cavities. Okay? So the viscera of the thoracic and abdominal cavities are going to be the primary organs of the autonomic nervous system. There are others, as we'll see. Some of the structures of the body wall are also controlled by the autonomic nervous system, such as the cutaneous blood vessels. What does that mean to you? Cutaneous? Yeah, referring to the skin. So blood vessels in the skin, sweat glands, and piloerector muscles. What are those? Those muscles in the skin that cause goosebumps, make your hair stand up. Yeah. So those are also controlled by the autonomic nervous system. Cutaneous blood vessels, think about that. So if the blood vessels of your skin dilate, especially if you're fair skinned, how do you look different? So think of somebody fair skinned. If their blood vessels in their skin dilate, that means there's more blood flow, so they're reddish, right? And if their blood vessels of their skin constrict, they're pale. Okay? And we'll see that those mechanisms are also involved in helping to maintain body temperature, right? So if a fair-skinned person is outside and it's 2 degrees outside, what do they look like? Sort of pale, because the blood vessels in their skin are constricting to hold heat in. So blood carries heat, and if you constrict the blood vessels, that heat stays in. If it's 100 degrees outside, that same person, they would appear reddish because the cutaneous blood vessels have dilated, and that is to give off heat. So that helps also with maintenance of body temperature. Remember, we said one thing the body does is sweat if it's too hot, but it also causes the cutaneous blood vessels to dilate to release heat. So it's actually 2 things going on there. And if you're really cold, your brain sends signals to your muscles to contract, so you shiver, but it also sends signals to your cutaneous blood vessels to allow you to your blood vessels to to dilate, to release some of that heat. Okay, so we'll see some of that. So again, all of that's happening while we're not even paying attention to it. General properties of the ANS: it carries out actions involuntarily, without our conscious intent or awareness. Visceral effectors do not depend on the ANS to function. And that may sound funny when all we're talking about here is how important it is for the ANS to interact with these organs to control their activity. But all this is saying is the autonomic nervous system only adjusts their activity. So in other words, the ANS does stimulate the heart, but the heart would beat if we didn't have the ANS. What would be the problem though? Notice your heart rate changes depending on what you're doing, right? So it's the autonomic nervous system that tells your heart to beat faster if you're outside running. But while you're sitting here, does your heart rate need to be that high? Okay. Okay. So the autonomic nervous system just tells the heart rate when to speed up and when to slow down. So without the autonomic nervous system, you would not have any of that flexibility. So it adjusts to the activities based on the whatever the body needs at that time. And then this denervation hypersensitivity just refers to the exaggerated response of the cardiac and smooth muscle if the autonomic nerves are severed. So if you cut the autonomic nerves, the muscles contract in an exaggerated way. So you may have a marked increase in the contraction of the muscles. Okay, the visceral reflex. This is what I call the baroreceptor. So when you all get to your study hints, I will ask you to know understand the baroreceptor, what it controls, which is blood pressure. Yes, it's a visceral reflex. The baroreceptor is a visceral reflex. Okay, and compare this to a somatic reflex. So a somatic reflex involves skeletal muscles. Okay, so this is a visceral reflex because it involves the cardiac muscle. But you still have those same 5 components. Remember the 5 components of a reflex arc? What are they? Good. So you have the receptor, sensory neuron, interneuron, motor neuron, and effector. So this is the baroreceptor which controls what? Blood pressure. Okay? So on the test I'm going to ask you how the baroreceptor work and what are the components in order. Okay? So again, blood pressure has to be maintained. There's that homeostasis again. So, any idea why, though? It's really important to understand the whys. Then the rest of it makes sense. Like, why does body temperature have to be maintained? Why can't we live when our body temperature is 50 degrees Fahrenheit or when it's 120 degrees Fahrenheit? Why can't we live under those conditions? So the bottom line is our cells die, right? Because those, and it goes back to the enzymes inside the cells that are functioning. So the cells, in order to work, those enzymes have to work. Those enzymes can't work if body temperature is too high or too low. So the cells don't work, we don't work. It's that simple. Okay? Same with pH. Changes in pH. What's the normal pH? That's neutral, but human body tissues have a pH of what? 7 point. Y'all heard that before? It's between 7.35 and 7.45. Okay, so that's the normal body pH of our body fluids, body tissues and blood has a pH between 7.35 and 7.45. So what if it goes up to 8 or down to 6? Our cells can't function. The enzymes stop working, the cells die, we die. Okay? Blood pressure. So we hear that high blood pressure is a silent killer. Why does our blood pressure matter? What do we mean by blood pressure? Exactly. So when you hear the word pressure, what does that even mean? What is pressure? Pressure is a force. Good. So when you say blood pressure, you're talking about the force of blood against whatever is holding the blood, whether it's the heart, right? We have blood in our heart, so it's the blood pushing against the walls of the heart, or more specifically, when talking about blood pressure, the pressure of blood against the vessels, the walls of the vessel. So if blood pressure is too high, what do you think is going to happen to the blood vessels? Think of a water balloon or a balloon. You blow it up the first time, it's kind of hard to blow it up. But you keep blowing it up, it gets what? It gets easier. So the walls, so the blood vessel walls can become weakened. Okay? And what can happen is there could be a small weakness in a blood vessel, and that causes a balloon, which is an aneurysm. Right? You all heard of aneurysm? So you have your blood vessel wall, and then part of it becomes weak, so it forms a balloon, a little bulb, and that can burst. So the weakness in the wall is what is going to lead to the aneurysm. And eventually, if it bursts, then that means blood is going to leak out of there instead of going to where the blood is supposed to go and nourish that part of the body. So if blood pressure is too high, you have that issue. Blood vessels weaken, that can lead to stroke. And we know how bad stroke is. Why is a stroke so bad? Well, what is affected? The brain, right? So the precentral gyrus or postcentral gyrus, those cells are going to die if they're not getting what? Oxygen and glucose. Okay, so that's important. Why don't we want blood pressure to be too low? So we want some force. We need a certain amount of force against the blood vessel wall, right? It can't be too high because over time they can weaken the vessel. But if it's too low, what is that going to do? Think about that. If blood pressure is too low, so the force of blood is not being pumped sufficiently to the tissues, right? So there's not enough pressure to push blood all the way to the brain. So the brain is not getting enough blood flow, so it's not getting enough what? Oxygen and glucose. And that's a concern if someone has an accident and they're bleeding. You want to stop the bleeding, because once the blood pressure drops too low, the heart is overworking because of this. So this same mechanism is in place when blood pressure is too low. There has to be a signal that lets the brain know blood pressure is too low, and the brain has to figure out how to increase pressure. So let's look at this for a moment. So the 5 components here are receptors, sensory neuron, interneuron, efferent neuron, and the heart, which is an effector. So on the test, you're going to need to know what each component is called. So the receptor here is located in a blood vessel, right? And so you have the carotid artery, and the blood vessel there has receptors in the walls of the blood vessel. So whenever the blood vessel is overstretched, that activates the baroreceptor. Okay? So once the receptor is activated, what happens next? All the time. So you activate a receptor, the sensory neuron does what? Sends a signal to the CNS. So the same thing happens here. But what you need to know, the name of the receptor is a baroreceptor, and it detects stretching of the vessel wall, and that activation of the receptor sends a signal to the CNS by way of the glossopharyngeal nerve. Okay? So what you want to pay attention to here is that the sensory neuron of the baroreflex is inside of the glossopharyngeal nerve. Okay? The sensory neurons are in the glossopharyngeal nerve. Okay? So you are remember nerves are bundles of axons, which are neurons, and those are located within the glossopharyngeal nerve. So now what happens? So you have the baroreceptor activated. A signal has been sent to the CNS by way of the glossopharyngeal nerve. And now we're in the CNS. But what part of the CNS? Medulla oblongata. Okay? So baroreceptors, sensory neurons in the glossopharyngeal nerve, interneuron in the interneurons are in the medulla oblongata. Okay? So what is happening in the medulla oblongata? Right. So the medulla has received the signal, making sense of the signal, and trying to what? Interpret the signal and come up with a solution to fix the problem. So it receives the signal, there's a problem. The blood pressure here is too high. So what can we do about it to decrease blood pressure? There are actually several mechanisms in the body to regulate blood pressure because it's so important to maintain. But most of those help to raise blood pressure. But here, what can the brain do? So the brain can send a signal to the heart, right? And that's what it does. So the brain says, okay, one way to reduce blood pressure is to make the heart beat slower. Okay? So when the heart beats slower, actually make that connection. Why would the heart beat slower? Why would that cause blood pressure to decrease? Right. So every time the heart contracts, blood is pushed into these vessels. Right? So the heart squeezes, blood is pushed into the arteries. When it relaxes, blood just kind of slows down. So every time when you feel your pulse, for example, you can feel exactly when your heart is beating, right? Every time it contracts, really the ventricles, when they contract, blood goes into your arteries and they expand. Okay? So every time your heart contracts, your arteries expand. So if you're up here in the carotid artery, if the heart is beating fast, what is the artery doing? It's stretching an awful lot, fairly often. Whereas if you decrease the heart rate, at least it's relaxing some of the time. Okay, so by decreasing the heart rate, the effect on the blood vessel wall is that at least it gets some time to relax. It's not just staying overstretched as much. Does that make sense? So by the activation of the baroreceptor Signal is sent to the brain. What part of the brain? The medulla oblongata. What sends the signal to the brain? The glossopharyngeal nerve, right? The sensory neurons in the glossopharyngeal nerve. The brain decides, okay, the best way to reduce blood pressure is to slow down the heart rate. So how does the signal get from the brain to the heart? Motor neurons, which are in the vagus nerve. Okay? So the vagus nerve has those motor neurons that tell the heart rate to slow down. Okay? Everybody get that? Hopefully it makes sense to you. So the heart then is the fifth component of the reflex arc. It is the effector, and the job of all effectors is what? To respond to the commands from the CNS. Good. All right, so that is an example of the baroreflex loop, also referred to as a visceral reflex, and a type of homeostatic negative feedback. All right. And now we get to the two divisions. So most of the focus on this chapter is going to be making sure you remember and understand the different roles of these two divisions, the sympathetic and parasympathetic divisions. I'm sure you all have heard of them before. And so there are two divisions of the autonomic nervous system. And so most of the effects that you're going to learn about are going to be opposite in the two divisions. Whereas the sympathetic division will increase heart rate, the parasympathetic division decreases heart rate. Okay? Now, so let's look at one at a time here. So the sympathetic division is called the fight or flight division. The fight or flight division. I think I'm going to put that up here also. And the parasympathetic is referred to as the rest and digest division. So sympathetic, fight or flight, parasympathetic, rest and digest. So that's just to let you know when these two divisions are most active. Okay? And keep in mind, we're still talking about the nervous system. We're still talking about the visceral motor division. So we're talking about signals going from the CNS out to these visceral effectors. Okay? So with the sympathetic division, this division prepares the body for physical activity. Don't do this to me. Oh, it didn't save it. Oh well. So what I put up there, the sympathetic and fight or flight and rest and digest, was deleted. But so the sympathetic division prepares the body for physical activity. So whenever you're exercising, experiencing trauma, arousal, competition, anger, fear, so emotions can have an effect on the divisions as well. So think about it. When you're afraid, what does your heart rate do? Speed up. When you're angry, speed up. When you're exercising, speeds up. So that's the sympathetic division telling your heart to increase in that situation. So what I'd like for you all to think about is an example that'll help you to remember these effects of the sympathetic nervous system. So the sympathetic division will increase your heart rate, increase your blood pressure. Now, is it clear that anytime your heart rate increases, that's going to increase your blood pressure? So from here on out, until you all expire, You should know anything that causes heart rate to increase is also going to cause blood pressure to increase, right? We just went over that with the barrel reflex. Anything that decreases heart rate does what to your blood pressure? It decreases your heart rate, blood pressure. Don't ever forget that. So your sympathetic division increases your heart rate, and because your heart rate increases, so does your blood pressure. The sympathetic division also increases airflow. What does that mean? What do you think that's referring to? Breathing? Right, breathing rate. So you breathe faster. Now, for me, and I think for you also, it's very difficult to just memorize this. It helps you a lot more if you get it, if you understand it. So to me, it's a good idea to have an example. And the one I always use, if you've listened to Integrity, is imagine yourself or someone else being chased down the street by someone with a big butcher knife. So if you're being chased by a madman with a knife down Bessemer Superhighway at 2:30 in the morning, what would you want your organs to do at that time, and why? And think about it. So what would you want your heart rate to do? You would want your heart rate to speed up, but why? To increase blood flow, right? Does that make sense? But why? And y'all gonna get tired of me asking these whys. Why do you want your blood flow to increase because somebody's chasing you with a knife? Right, so increased blood flow is going to take what? More blood to your skeletal muscles, right? So you can keep running, right? So what's in the blood that your skeletal muscles need? Oxygen and glucose, so the muscles can make ATP, which is needed for the muscles to keep contracting and relaxing. Okay, so same when you're on your treadmill. You got muscles contracting. Those muscles are using up energy. So they're going to need more and more oxygen and glucose. So when you're running from that madman, you want your sympathetic division to tell your heart rate to speed up. And you also want increased blood pressure because that makes sure the blood is actually getting to the tissues. Okay? Airflow. Why do you want to increase airflow? Huh? So you won't fall out when you're running. So why would you fall out? So what is airflow doing for you when you're running from the madman? Airflow, when you breathe in, what is that doing? Bringing oxygen into what? Into your blood, right? You all just said we want to increase heart rate so that blood is getting pumped to the muscles faster. But what good is blood pumping fast if there's no oxygen in it? Right? So you want to increase the oxygen in your blood so that the oxygen is being sent to the cells. Sympathetic division increases blood glucose. Why would we want to increase blood glucose levels? Huh? Right. So we need increased blood flow, but the blood isn't just flowing for fun. It's delivering something to the muscles, right? Delivering what? Oxygen and glucose. So the cells can make what? ATP. So you want all of that to happen in order for you to keep running so your muscles don't fatigue and you don't just give up and fall out. Okay? That's another reason why it's important to exercise on a regular basis, because you start to, one of the things is you increase blood vessels in your brain, so your brain gets more oxygen. That helps with studying too. I'll get to that next week. So when you exercise, there are certain chemicals that the brain produces, and there's more blood supply being sent to the brain. But also with your other tissues, you have, your muscles are going to have a buildup of the the materials needed, oxygen and glucose, in order for them to perform at a maximum level. So reduces blood flow. So here's some other effects of the sympathetic division. It reduces blood flow to the skin and also reduces blood flow to the digestive tract. Now, that may not be so clear. So if you're being chased by a madman, why would you want to reduce blood flow to the skin and digestive tract? That's not really helping anything in that sense, except if you want to increase the amount of blood going to your skeletal muscles, which you do, you have to decrease blood from going somewhere else, right? So the circulatory system is closed. So there's no way to increase blood flow to my arm if I'm not decreasing blood flow some other part of my body. So the parts of the body that do not need the energy as readily at that point are going to have a decrease in blood flow, and that's going to be the skin and the digestive tract. Okay? And that's why they say it's not a good idea to go out and exercise as soon as you've eaten, because you need all of that blood flow going to your digestive system, so that process of the digestive process completes before you do that. Otherwise you get sick and food is not digested and it comes back up. Okay, so the parasympathetic division is rest and digest. Calms many body functions, reduces energy expenditures, and assists in bodily maintenance. So right now, your parasympathetic division is probably in more control of your body than sympathetic. Now, another point I wanted to make, both the sympathetic and parasympathetic division are always working. There's kind of a balance, and you'll see something called autonomic tone, T-O-N-E, and that's just the normal balance between the sympathetic and parasympathetic divisions. So again, there are sets of neurons stimulating organs, and but there's a balance between them. Now, when you start running from the madman, the sympathetic activity just increases. So it kind of takes over the activity of the heart, and the parasympathetic division is kind of in the background. But when you're sitting home, when you're eating, the sympathetic division is taking a back seat, and the parasympathetic division is most active, allowing digestion of the foods that you're eating and waste elimination. And that's going to include the digestive contractions that happen in your stomach and your intestines. So it's called the rest and digest division. All right. And so I'm going to stop here, but I want you all to try to look over the sympathetic effects and try to make as much sense of those as you can. The sympathetic effects, and actually, if you look at my lecture that's already up there, I'll go over this. And this is you're going to have to know this for the lab assignment that's due next week. So as soon as you get a chance, make sure you go over the sympathetic effects and the parasympathetic effects and have a decent understanding of those.